Welcome to another World History class. Good to have you, and we are doing well. Praise God. Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for the participants in this course. Thank you for the system that you have given us to make this course possible. I pray, Lord, your blood coverage and protection upon myself and upon the participants in the system. Amen. We're going to continue where we left off. And we were looking at the idea of civilization in world historical perspective. Civilization in world historical perspective. In the 20th century, and we are now in the 21st century, much of the intellectual baggage that once gave credibility to the racially embedded hierarchies of civilized and savage peoples has been discarded, which is good. Racist thinking has been discredited by 20th century developments, including the revolt of the colonized peoples and the crimes committed by the Nazi before and during World War II in the name of racial purification. In addition, these ideas have failed because racial supremacists cannot provide convincing proof of innate differences in mental and physical aptitude between various human groups, because developments have taken place all over. Even these aqueducts and great buildings in Jamaica and elsewhere in the Caribbean and the Americas, that history written from the metropole perspective has glorified these Europeans, so-called supremacists. Now that history has been reviewed, that is called, review of history. It's called historiography. It has been proven that it was the same people who they put down and who they considered subhumans. It was they who did the construction. These Africans. Enslaved Africans. It was they who did the constructions. It wasn't these so-called white supremacists. No. The history then was written from the perspective of the metropole, France and England and Spain and Portugal and so on. Right? So those misguided, inaccurate views have been dashed, of course. These trends, as well as research that has resulted in a much more sophisticated understanding of evolution, have led to the abandonment of rigid and self-serving 19th century ideas about civilization. Yet, even though non-European people such as the Indians and Chinese are increasingly given credit for their civilized attainments, much ethnocentrism remains in the way social theorists determine who is civilized and who is not. Social theorists. Perhaps the best way to avoid the tendency to define the term with reference to one's own society is to view civilization as one of several human approaches to social organization, rather than attempting to identify specific kinds of cultural achievement. So I read it again. Perhaps the best way to avoid the tendency to define the term with reference to one's own society is to view civilization as one of several human approaches to social organization, rather than attempting to identify specific kinds of cultural achievement, example, writing, cities, monumental culture, and so on. All peoples, from small bands or hunters and gatherers to farmers and factory workers, live in societies. All societies produce cultures, combinations of the ideas, objects, and patterns of behavior that result from human social interaction. But not all societies and cultures generate the surplus production that permits the levels of specialization, scale, and complexity that distinguish civilizations from other modes of social organization. All peoples are intrinsically capable of building civilizations, but many have lacked the resource, base, historical circumstances, or desire to do so. So, you have not gotten a clear definition because it is difficult to be defined. It is rather a definition of civilization. It is difficult to be defined. So, what the attempt is to describe it and give descriptions and identify factors that you know um, contribute to our civilization. And one of them is the capacity to produce on a scale that will create surpluses, and also the complexity of life that distinguish one social organization from another. Not only distinguish, but it places a particular social organization above another because of the technology that it has, military technology, um, social organization, efficiency, effectiveness, things like that. We're going to be looking here at what is called the first towns, seabeds of civilization. By about 7000 BCE, techniques of agricultural production in the Middle East had reached a level at which it was possible to support thousands of people, many of whom were not engaged in agriculture, in density populated settlements. In these and other Middle Eastern Neolithic settlements, occupational specialization and formation of religious and political military elite groups advanced significantly. Trade became essential for the community's survival and was carried on with peoples at considerable distances, perhaps by specialized merchants. Crafts such as pottery, metalworking, and jewelry making were highly developed. Two of the earliest of these settlements were at Jericho, in what is today part of Palestine, and at Katel, Huyuk in present-day southern Turkey, with populations of about 2,000 and 4,000 to 6,000 people, respectively. Jericho and Katel, Huyuk would be seen today as little more than large villages or small towns, but in the perspective of human cultural development, they represented the first stirrings of urban life. Stirrings. These earlier centers were quite isolated. They were merely tiny islands of farmers and small numbers of townspeople surrounded by vast plains and woodlands. The earliest town centers appear to have traded extensively, but they maintained only intermittent and limited contacts with neighboring hunting and gathering peoples. Though small and not highly specialized in comparison with the cities of Sumer and other early civilizations, the first towns played critical roles in continuing the Neolithic Revolution. Their ruling elites and craft specialists contributed to the production in the 4th millennium BC of critical inventions such as the wheel, the plow, writing, and use of bronze that secure the future of civilized life as a central pattern of human history. We're going to look at Jericho. Proximity to the Jordan River and the deep and clear waters of an oasis spring account for repeated human settlement at the place where the town of Jericho was built. By 7000 BCE, more than 10 acres were occupied by round houses of mud and brick resting on stone foundations. Most early houses had only a single room with mud plaster floors and a dome ceiling, but some houses had as many as 3 rooms. Entry to these windowless dwellings was provided by a single wood framed doorway and steps down to the floor of the main room underground. Although there is no evidence that Jericho was fortified in the early stages of its growth, its expanding wealth made the building of walls for protection from external enemies necessary. The town was enclosed by a ditch cut into the rocky soil and a fall almost 12 feet high, and a wall. Mhm. The extensive excavation needed for this construction was impressive because the peoples who undertook it had neither picks nor shovels. The stones for the wall were dragged from a riverbed nearly a mile away. These feats suggest a sizable labor force that was well organized and disciplined. Also, they had, great engineering skills because they knew that for the wall to stand up, they had to excavate, they had to have footing, strong footing in uh, in uh, in excavation. When Jericho was rebuilt in later centuries, the wall reached a height of nearly 15 feet, and the fortification included a stone tower at least 25 feet high. The area covered by the town increased. Round houses gave way to rectangular ones, entered through larger and more elaborately decorated wooden doorways. Houses were made of improved bricks and provided with plaster, earths, and stone mills for grinding grain. They were also furnished with storage baskets and straw mats. Small buildings have been uncovered that were used as religious shrines during the later stages of the town's history. Although Jericho's economy was based primarily on wheat and barley farming, there is considerable evidence of reliance on hunting and trade. Domesticated goats provided meat and milk, and gazelles and various marsh birds were hunted for their flesh, hides, and feathers. The town was close to large supplies of salt, sulfur, and pitch. These materials, which were in great demand during this era, were traded for obsidian, a dark plastic-like volcanic rock, semi-precious stones from Anatolia, turquoise from the Sinai, and cowrie shells from the Red Sea. The ruins excavated at Jericho indicate that the town was governed by a distinct and powerful ruling group, which probably was allied to the keepers of the shrine centers. There were specialized artisans and a small merchant class. In addition, so you see the division of labor there coming up. In addition to fertility, figurines, and animal carvings like those found at many other sites, the inhabitants of Jericho sculpted life-size, highly naturalistic human figures and heads. Mhm. The first community at this site in southern Turkey was founded around 7000 BCE, somewhat later than the earliest settlements at Jericho. But the town that grew up at Katal Huyuk was a good deal more extensive than that at Jericho, and it contained a larger and more diverse population. Katal Huyuk was the most advanced human center of the Neolithic Age. At the peak of its power and prosperity, the city occupied 32 acres and contained as many as 6,000 people. Mhm. Talking about the Neolithic Age. Its rectangular buildings, which were centers of family life and community interaction, were remarkably uniform and were built of mud dried bricks. They had windows high in their walls and were entered from holes in their flat roofs. These stairways also served as chimneys. The presence of stored food in early towns such as Katal, Huyuk made the houses tempting targets for nomadic bands or rival settlements. For that reason, they were increasingly fortified. The standardization of housing and construction at Katal, Huyuk suggests an even more imposing ruling group than that found at Jericho. The many religious shrines at the site also indicate the existence of a powerful priesthood. The shrines were built in the same way as ordinary houses, but they contained sanctuaries surrounded by 4 or 5 rooms related to the centers. The shrine centers. The walls of these religious centers were filled with paintings of bulls and carrion eaters, especially vultures, suggesting fertility cults and rites associated with death. The obvious importance of the cult shrines and the elaborate burial practices of the peoples of Katal, Huyuk, reveal the growing role of religion in the lives of Neolithic peoples. So as far back as then, Stone Age, New Stone Age, people were religious. The carefully carved sculptures associated with the sanctuaries and the fine jewelry, mirrors, and weapons found buried with the dead attest to the high level of material culture and artistic proficiency of these town dwellers. Excavations also reveal an economic base that was much broader and richer than that of Jericho. Hunting remained important, but the breeding of goats, sheep, and cattle vastly surpassed that associated with Jericho. Catalhuyuk's inhabitants consumed a wide range of foods, including several grains, peas, berries, berry wine, and vegetable oils made from nuts. Trade was extensive with the peoples in the surrounding hills and also in places as distant as present-day Syria and the Mediterranean region. Catalhuyuk was also a major center of production by artisans. Its flint and obsidian weapons, jewelry, and obsidian mirrors were some of the finest produced in the Neolithic Age. The remains of the town's culture leave little doubt that its inhabitants had achieved a civilized level of existence. So you're talking about the first towns. The first towns, seed beds of civilization. Those are the seed beds, those towns. Jericho, Sumer not mentioned, but Sumer would be, if it was later than these, it was also one of the seed beds of civilization. Although Jericho, Katal, and similar settlements can best be seen as towns rather than cities by our standard, they displayed many of the characteristics that have come to be associated with urban life. Perhaps they were too small and too dependent on crops grown by their own inhabitants to be labeled cities, but they clearly set the patterns for layout, fortification, and standardization that would be found in the first cities in neighboring regions such as Mesopotamia and Egypt, and in distant urban complexes such as Harappa in northwest India. and Kush and Axum in Africa. The level of specialization and political organization these early townspeople had attained proved critical to the invention and dissemination of new tools and production techniques during the fourth millennium BCE. The years from 4000 to 3000 BCE saw a second wave of major transformations in human culture in the Middle East and nearby regions. These shifts marked the transition from the last of the Stone Age to the Bronze Age and succeeding periods of metalworking. Of course. During this transition from one era to the other, the use of the plow significantly increased crop yields. Yes, because the soils were better prepared because of the plow. And wheeled vehicles made it possible to carry more food and other raw materials over greater distances. So you talk wheeled vehicles have to do with carts, not even chariots, because they were not, but carts and buggies, drays. Both developments meant that larger, non-cultivating populations could be supported and concentrated in particular locales. Although copper had been used for spear and axe heads for millennia, accident and experiment revealed that when copper was mixed with other metals such as tin, it formed bronze. Oh, that's how bronze came into being. Copper mixed with tin, a harder and more durable material. The bronze tools that resulted further enhanced agricultural production. Trade-oriented, specialized, and wealthy urban peoples were also more likely than isolated nomadic hunters and gatherers to own bronze weapons, so they would be able to put up a greater resistance to to an invading band of nomadic people because they have superior weapons, which were much lighter and more lethal than those made of stone. Much lighter, more lethal. Finally, the development of writing, first in Mesopotamia and later in India, China, and other centers of agrarian production, greatly improved communications in ways that made it possible to expand trading networks and enlarge bureaucracies. Both were essential to maintaining large human complexes. The long isolation of American Indian peoples from the centers of civilization in Africa, Asia, and Europe prevented the diffusion of much of the new technology developed in a variety of centers at different times. This diffusion and ongoing exchange of objects and ideas between the civilized peoples of the Eastern Hemisphere played a key role in the founding and growth of civilizations. Lacking these contacts, the peoples of the Americas built civilizations that were wonderfully sophisticated in many areas, but were far behind those of the Eastern Hemisphere in critical areas such as technological innovation. Their civilizations also developed in very different animal, and disease environments than those in Eastern Hemisphere. I read again. Lacking these contacts, the people of the Americas built civilizations that were wonderfully sophisticated in many areas, but were far behind those of the Eastern Hemisphere in critical areas such as technological innovation and the harnessing of animal and machine power. Their civilizations also developed in very different plant, animal, and disease environments than those in Eastern Hemisphere. As a consequence, the peoples and plant and animal species of areas such as the Americas, Australia, and South Pacific prove highly vulnerable to the diseases, technology, and life forms introduced from Africa and Eurasia. Mhm. And that was one of the reasons why the people of the Americas, say early people, the Indian peoples in Mexico and Peru, any say the Americas, because that would it same thing happened in the Caribbean. They died. That was one of the causes of death, rapid death, cause of rapid death among those peoples because the Europeans brought with them certain diseases for which they had not developed any immunity. They couldn't withstand the diseases. They had no immunity to them. So they died. Overwork, cruelty, wickedness, murder, slaughter contributed significantly to their death. Many of them committed suicide also because of the conditions. They had been accustomed to an easy lifestyle. They had been their own bosses. And they worked at their own pace. Now they were captured and being bullied and oppressed and exploited by invaders, ill-treated, underfed. Their whole lives, they just couldn't cope with the Europeans. They couldn't cope with them. They had been accustomed to their own lifestyle and to work at their own pace. Now, again, language was a problem. They couldn't communicate that easily with the Europeans. Neither way, Europeans did not understand them. They didn't understand it, and they were being forced to find gold, and they were being questioned and and boxed up and roughed up and kicked down and chopped, by these people. It's amazing because it was few Europeans compared to the multitude of them. Yet the Europeans were able to overpower them. They tried it in the Far East, but it did not work. Japan, India, China, it didn't work. They couldn't do to them, those people, what they did in the West. It did not work. But you do your reflection and email me. God bless you.